Hi, I'm Duncan Pelly. I am an associate professor of entrepreneurship at McMurray University, pictured here in the background. And today I'm going to talk to you about a very unusual and unfortunate story. And the paper is titled Opening the Sadean Menagerie Metaphors from a Contemporary Business Ph.D. Program. Before I launch into the meat and potatoes of what I'll be discussing for the next 15 minutes, let me give you a roadmap of the contents of this presentation. I'll first start with just telling you how I got started in this particular paper. Then I'll give you a primer in sadism. I'll talk about the methodology that I'm using this paper, the Sadean autoethnography. I'll tell you just a little bit about what's going on in the empirical setting itself. I'll tell you a little bit about the vignettes of the paper, and then I actually have some questions for you, the audience. So the spark of this paper came from my reading of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Reflections on the Social Contract. And he's famous for saying that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. And Rousseau described kind of this noble savage who wandered around in the forest all by his or herself. And this noble savage was somebody that was fundamentally good. Well, I just didn't buy that. And there is one writer who was almost a contemporary of Rousseau who made an entire mockery of Rousseau's writings, and that is Donatien Alphonse Francois, also known as the Marquis de Sade. Now, some of you may be familiar with de Sade because you've heard of the term sadism, but for the purposes of this paper and this presentation, we're referring to the original ideas of Marquis de Sade, not writings on, for example, sadomasochism. Sadism, to be clear, is a coherent system of ethics, but it is very different from the ethics that we normally describe in society. It is a form of ethics that is anti-liberal, anti-humanist, anti-democratic, and anti-women. It thrives in the contempt for human dignity, and it believes that anyone who is a libertine or anyone who has power ultimately has the right to orgasm, has the right to take power from others. And so that's the idea of de Sade. But in my own readings of de Sade, I've extrapolated a lot to look at how systems are created that generate power, and more specifically, how individuals can thrive in the moment, how they can take pleasure in just about everything, whether that's socioeconomic exploitation, almost a class-based exploitation similar to Marxism. So I think sadism can be, well expanded beyond its sexual components for which it is mostly known. So let me tell you a little bit about the methodology that I use in this paper. I use the autoethnography as kind of the foundation, and autoethnography is a methodology that uses the self to describe relationships with the other and the whole. In other words, it uses individual experiences as the basis for describing the world. And it postulates actually that if you are a complete member researcher or you are embedded in a certain context, then your voice should be heard. It's also a methodology that prides itself on giving voice to the voiceless. So I wanted to take what I've done on autoethnography already and add kind of a little Marquis de Sade twist. And Marquis de Sade is known for a few things in his almost autoethnographic writings. First of all, he's known for his use of archetypes. And archetypes basically are a way of using certain kinds of individuals with certain kinds of characteristics for the purposes of theoretical extrapolation. So, for example, when the Marquis de Sade writes about a priest or a bishop or a clergyman, he's not describing a specific priest, bishop, or clergyman. He's just using that as kind of a metaphor for religious institutions more generally. By the same token, if he talks about a duke, it's not a specific duke, but it's a commentary on the aristocracy more generally. So I've taken that as one of his writing techniques, specifically to actually protect the identities of some of the characters, some of the libertines in this story, because they are all faculty at different universities now. So I want to provide a degree of anonymity. Also, de Sade, according to Mary Trury, has an enduring quality, and that is namely that he can infect our imagination. And so I wanted to take that same Sadean quality of using kind of illustrations through hyperbole and exaggeration to infect the imaginations of the reader so that the reader can extrapolate some of the findings of this paper for their own ways and their own reasons. Now, I also took a third piece from Marquis de Sade and also autoethnographic literature, and I'm using what's known as a layered account. And so layered accounts are what Marquis de Sade would call chopping up the action into brief tableau or little vignettes. So we've got little storytelling vignettes with titles that are in italics, and then I, post hoc, extrapolate those with theoretical vignettes with titles in bold, and that's designed to provide a degree of generalizability for the reader. So let me tell you a little bit about the empirical setting of this paper. This is a heterotopia, and a heterotopia is somewhere that simultaneously inhabits space and place, or you could say that it inhabits neither space nor place. It is a region with a coherent ethics system and a region with a coherent narrative. It can almost be described as the open region, to use the terms of Heidegger. But it's a place and a space that is in some way separate from mainstream reality. That's the heterotopia. And it's quite interesting because all of de Sade's adventures have to have a heterotopia in order for him to effectuate them. So he's usually, perpetuating his kind of atrocities in an isolated dungeon, an isolated monastery, a basement, a brothel, somewhere where he believes that the all-seeing eye of God cannot see. And so there's a fair amount of literature right now in business ethics that is looking at, how do we actually create these kind of artificial heterotopia, these artificial spaces to see, is man fundamentally good, as Rousseau would say, or is man fundamentally evil, as de Sade would say? But we do have one, and that's what I'm writing about. And this heterotopia is something that was called the Menagerie. It took place in a leading French business school's Ph.D. program. It was the Ph.D. office, and it was comprised of 40 open office or open air office spaces for all the PhD students across the program. So all the different cohorts were housed in there. And this picture that I use is quite illustratable. It reminded me of an elementary school bus where, the parents and the teachers aren't there, so all hell breaks loose on a daily basis. Um, and so that's where the adventures of this particular story take place. So let me tell you just a couple of the vignettes to give you a flavor for what's going on with this Sadean Menagerie. How does this Lord of the Flies situation actually take place? Now you see I've got a picture of some cups of coffee. Let me tell you that story. Well, I might have been a little bit of a sadist in graduate school myself with regards to Marquis de Sade. So what winds up happening? There was an executive education lounge, which most business schools have. It was just for MBA students, exec ed students, and faculty who taught in those programs, and had amazing coffee and pastries and juices. I mean, just delectable things for consumption on a daily basis. And of course, I wasn't allowed in there, and I couldn't go in there because I didn't have the code until one night I was riding home on the bus, and I heard some intoxicated MBA students discussing the code. And it was pretty easy for me to remember because it was my grandma's birth year. So the next day I went in there, I punched in the code, and I went in there and I was getting coffee. And the head of the PhD program looks at me and he sneers and he says, "Well, just what do you think you're doing?" And I looked right back at him. I said, "I'm doing the same thing you're doing. I'm stealing coffee." And he got kind of flushed, but he walked away and he didn't say anything. I knew he wasn't supposed to be there either because he didn't teach those programs. So slowly but surely, I wound up telling some of the other PhD students that I'd been going and stealing coffee, and they started coming with me. And so we were all stealing coffee, snacks, and pastries pretty much on a daily basis. And I'd like to think that we were kind of pioneers, but quite frankly, I had some inspiration from the head of the PhD program because I knew he was stealing coffee already. And so we started all going in there as PhD students, and then other faculty started going in there because if PhD students could go in there, why couldn't faculty? And then staff members started going in there too. And next thing you knew, people were in there all the time taking coffee, snacks, pastries, etc. And the president of the university actually kind of laughed. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, let's just make this an employee benefit. Everybody can go there. I like what I see. I like the fact that people are going in there and changing ideas and being social with each other. So it's just a benefit. Everybody can go." Well, unfortunately, some of our PhD students who were sadists, an extent, they followed my less than stellar example, and they started going in. Um, to the offices of the menagerie and taking the coffee and the snacks and everything, but more than just consuming it for daily use. They were bringing their grocery store buggies and just filling them every day. And they were taking industrial sized things of jam, whole sticks of butter, salt and pepper, 50 to 60 croissants at a time. And then they were just bringing them back to the menagerie and letting them rot on the floor. And we tried to put a stop to it, but eventually the president finally said, "Well, you're going to have to pay a fee of €1 if you want to access the exec ed lounge." And all the students protested and said that he was trampling on their rights. And at that point, the president said, well, I've had enough. There'll be no more executive ed lounge. And why does this relate to sadism? Well, the first part is, de Sade so infamously said, if the fruit can be plucked, you have the right to take the fruit, irrespective of the benefit to the individual or the institution. So that's exactly what we were doing. We were plucking this fruit. Now, the other thing about what was going on in the black box is the fact that when someone in power, the president of the university, said, don't do that, our members of our PhD program pretended to be victims. We claimed that our rights were being trampled, especially the worst offenders. That's very de Sade as well. He was a terror with women when he thought no one was looking, yet he whimpered and cried whenever he was confronted regarding his behavior. Let me give another example. I've got this Scantron. I've got some pictures of some journals. We had one of our former PhD alums who had taken a job at a different university, and he was notorious for driving 4 hours back to his PhD alma mater. And what would he do? He would come up to the PhD students and he would tell me, he'd say, hey, what do you think about selling me some of your PhD course papers? The first time he said that, I looked at him. I said, what? What are you talking about? Who's going to buy that garbage I wrote as a first-year PhD student? He said, well, let me tell you a little secret. My university values academic freedom. So we have A, B, and C publications like everywhere else, but we also have a D level of publication. And the D level of publication means you can publish anything, anywhere. You can publish in, a newspaper. You can publish, a book chapter, a book, and any other kind of a journal that's not on a list. And they said, well, and I get a publication bounty of 250 euros every time I publish in a D-level journal. So let me give you 50 euros for your paper, and then I'll publish. And I get promotion points for this. And I'll tell you, he said, I found these journals in China, and they will publish anything. And I mean anything, as long as you pay your fee. He said, I'm going to make associate professor soon. And in fact, he made associate in 3 years with this particular scheme. Now, why do I bring this up as the side? Well, most of us in academia would agree that that kind of behavior was wrong. It can be interpreted as cheating. But there's something about this menagerie, this heterotopia that's separate, where this individual felt the need to be an overlord over his former colleagues. And I used to always laugh, even after he would buy PhD papers. On his way out of the office, he would empty the PhD office cabinet. He'd take all the pens, pencils, and papers he could get his hands on, take them with him. And one time I said, dude, what are you doing? Like, don't you have supplies where you live? And he said, yes, I do, but I am free to take these back and sell them because in my program we have to pay for our supplies. So the department has to pay for them. And let me give you two more anecdotes to illustrate. Um, we also had an individual known as Dr. Snoop, and Dr. Snoop really liked to abuse the privileges of the menagerie. So what he was doing is he was leasing out office space to individuals at night to supplement the meager lodging options near campus. And after a point, he no longer wanted to rent anymore, and his lodgers never got the message. We couldn't stop people from using his desk. Now, we never saw these people, but we always saw evidence of their sojourns, half-drunken coffee, used hygiene products, half-eaten food. And when he finally decided to stop renting, he got really mad because the people kept coming and they weren't paying him. And I remember he said, why does this always happen to me? And we laughed. He said, well, you brought it on yourself. It's the same thing that's going on here. This individual was much like Desan. He was a kind of a terror within his own little space that he could rent out to people. But when his charges no longer got the message that that behavior was no longer welcome, he claimed to be some sort of a victim. And I've got more vignettes in the paper, and if you'd like to read a little bit more about what's going on, I encourage you to do so, and I welcome your feedback. Now, my last thing that I want to leave to you, the audience, is I'm struggling with publication opportunities. I was rejected from Academy of Management, Learning, and Education after a 2-year process, which involved multiple revise and resubmits. So I'd like to know, where do you think I could submit a paper like this? Again, I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your attending my virtual presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions and answers.